Hello, this is Dr. Bass. Welcome to the channel. In this series, I'm going to be converting this 1960s 14-foot aluminum Starcraft into this here tiny bass boat. The purpose of this series is to provide some instructional commentary along the way for those of you interested in how to do this kind of build. Now that we've completed the painting process, it's time to begin framing the deck. By the end of this video, we'll have most of the deck framed in. Let's get started. Now, the cool thing about building a tiny boat is you can make it your own. What I did is I went online and watched a lot of people build these boats in different ways and got a lot of ideas. And before I began the build process, I made a scale drawing of my boat and then sketched out what I would like my boat to look like. Now, inevitably, it's not going to look exactly like you set out to be or to the scale that you set it out to be, because as you build, you discover there are certain things you have to make subtle adjustments to. But nonetheless, what you'll see if you watch this series all the way through is that I stick roughly to this design where it has the two kind of side bins on it, side walls on it, and then it has all these hatches that you see here. So I'll continue to refer back to this drawing as I go through the build, but again, I encourage you to kind of do this on your own first before you even begin to do the build. It will help you a great deal. The other thing that you'll want to do in your drawing is imagine where all of the angle is going to go for your frame. In this drawing, I am literally trying to sketch out not only the exterior of the boat and the hatches, but also if you look closely, you'll see that I'm trying to put where I imagine all the angle to go that I'm going to use to frame the boat. And that gave me a rough idea of how much angle I had to purchase to build the boat. One thing to bear in mind is that the more complicated your decking is, the more hatches you have, the more angle you're going to require to complete the build. If you have a very simple deck, you'll require a lot less angle. The more complicated, the more angle, the more expensive. When I added up all of the angle based on this drawing, it came out to about 150 feet, which was almost exactly what I needed to build the boat. The aluminum angle that I used was 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch by 1/8 inch thick. To buy that where I live costs $333. In addition to the aluminum angle, I purchased a bit of aluminum tubing. You can see all the figures there. It comes out to roughly $417 to do all of the aluminum framing. Another thing you'll need before you begin framing the deck is to have the actual hatches or the storage you plan to use below the deck. If you don't have these, you'll just be guessing on the size. I use these HDX bins from Home Depot because they're really cheap. Of course, you can pay for your own hatches, your own storage that comes prefabricated. But whatever you do, make sure you have those before you start framing the deck. There's really no use in trying to frame the deck without having those dimensions. I use these narrow boxes from the garden center for the sidewall hatches. I bought a battery box to store my battery in this center hatch. You'll want to have your pedestal seat mount in advance so you have the dimensions to that. You're going to need to have that mounted into the aluminum. So whether you use aluminum flooring or plywood flooring, you're still going to need that aluminum angle in place to mount that pedestal seat to reinforce it. So it's important that you also have that up front. I wanted to be able to remove my gas tank, so I wanted to make sure that I had enough space to remove it, so having that is important as well. Finally, I left this opening in the deck in the rear to provide some air for the gas tank, but also to run the gas line and the bilge pump line through. Alright, now that we've accounted for everything we want in the boat and we have a rough idea of the dimensions for the frame, it's time to begin the framing process. When putting a deck in a V-bow, it can be tricky to figure out how to level the deck. How far should it be from the top of the gunnel? Rather than use the top of the gunnel, I use the original seat mounts as a way of leveling the deck. I trust that the original engineers of these boats knew where to place these seat brackets, so I trust that they are at the appropriate level for the deck. So to begin, I'm going to use my two different sizes of aluminum tubing to create a mount to set the outside angle on for the frame. And when it's all done, they should look something like this, with a 3/4 inch on the bottom and the 1.25 inches on the top. You'll notice I leave just enough room between the gunnel and the top tubing to be able to slide the aluminum angle between them. When you're all done, you'll have these 6 mounts ready to support the perimeter of the frame. We're now going to create this triangular frame at the bow of the boat. What I've discovered is that the level that the engineers place the seats also lines up with the eye bolt at the front of the boat. Because my tubing sits 1.25 inches above the seat, I'm going to make this little mount go 1.25 inches above the eye bolt. And now that that's in place, I can measure, mark, and cut the aluminum angle that's going to become the supports for the front bow decking. I use a marker to mark the exact angle of where I want this to go because I need to pull it off and rivet it together. Speaking of rivets, for most of the build I used a 3/16 rivet with a 3/4 inch grip. Now that the V-bow is riveted together, I'm going to put it back on this bolt, put the nut on, and then you'll see the finished product. Now we're going to move to the back to place this rear angle on the transom. To make sure these are at the right height, all you have to do is run a level or a piece of tubing back from the seat mounts, as seen here. And here they are installed. Now that the hard part is done, we're just going to measure, mark, and cut the rest of the outside perimeter angle. Now you can use a hacksaw for this, but I highly recommend using an aluminum chop saw. I had a good friend Bryce who lent me his, and it saved me a tremendous amount of time and agony. I'm now just setting down those outside angles and riveting them in place, placing 2 rivets on each connection. Now that the outside perimeter is complete, it's time to tackle the front and rear decks. To do this, you're going to need 2 vice grips to hold the aluminum in place while you're drilling and riveting. To ensure the horizontal parts of the frame are square, I recommend measuring from the transom forward on both sides. Once you have them where you want them, go ahead and rivet them in place. You'll notice I put the horizontal angle below the perimeter angle. You'll just want to use your discretion when doing this. Sometimes you'll put them above, sometimes you'll put them below. At the end of the day, it's not really that important as long as you do it consistently. Alright, now it's time to start shaping the rear casting deck. Whatever you're using for storage, again, if you're putting hatches, you're going to want that with you so you can get the dimensions correct as you're building the deck. Whenever you're joining 2 angles in a perpendicular fashion, you may need to notch the angle as seen here. When running angle from the front to the back, you need to make sure you have a good center line. To do that, simply run a string from the transom mount up to the bolt at the bow of the boat. Mark your center, and then you can measure outward every time you place a piece. Now that I've installed those 2 main angles running vertically, what I'm going to do is create a support for the rear deck right in the center. Here's a couple different angles just to give you some perspective on how I did that support. You can also see how the rear deck is beginning to take shape. Because I'm going to be cutting this hatch out at the edge of the plywood, I'm doubling up the angle here so I have enough plywood left over on this edge so it doesn't crack very easily once I cut the hatch out. Hopefully that will make sense as things come together. Alright, we're going to leave the back deck now and turn to the front deck to begin framing that. Again, you're going to want your bins with you or your storage with you to make sure your dimensions are correct. The first order of business is to center this pedestal seat mount and make sure we have that placed correctly. To do that, what I've done is put two pieces of angle back to back and riveted them together to reinforce the strength. You'll see here in this close-up that I've run 4 rivets across each end of these. I really want these to be strong because again the pedestal seat is going to be mounted directly into these. To ensure that you've got these in the right place, it's important that you know the exact dimensions of the seat base. And to conclude this part of the build, we're going to start framing the sidewalls. Again, to do that, we're going to need our storage bins, which in this case are the planter boxes. Once you're done using the chop saw, whiskey is really helpful. And that concludes this second video. If you have any questions or if there's anything I didn't cover, feel free to leave me a note in the comments and I'll try to respond to you as soon as possible. Well, the whiskey's gone, so I'll see you in the next video as we continue the build. Thanks for watching.